Michael Ellis is one of the top professional dog training instructors in the world. We here at Leerburg have produced and will continue to produce dog training DVDs with Michael. We've also begun to stream video on-demand lessons with Michael Ellis. These lessons are the opening lectures for the various courses that Michael teaches at his school for dog trainers in California. These lectures lay out the training theory along with the step-by-step training methods for the courses that Michael teaches at his school. For a number of reasons, these lectures will never be offered on DVD. They will only be offered on video on demand. When a customer purchases our video on demand lessons, they'll be allowed to watch the videos for 3 weeks. We feel that's more than enough time for a student to study the content of the lesson. We also recommend you take notes because there's a lot of information being put forward here in a short period of time. The fact is, we intend to stream the opening lectures for all of Michael's courses. Students that attend the classes will be expected to have studied these theory lessons. This will allow Michael to modify his courses and spend much more time with actual hands-on instruction with students and their dogs. The video you're watching is just a few minutes of the opening lecture for Michael's class on the proper use of an electric collar. Remote collars are one of the most effective dog training tools ever invented. To take advantage of the power behind electric collars, trainers need to understand the tool. They need to understand how to condition their dogs to an electric collar, and they need to know how and when to layer a remote collar into the obedience training of their dog. Michael's lectures cover these points in a great deal of detail. No one is going to learn how to do all these things with a remote collar in 30 to 60 minutes. It's simply not going to happen. And that's why we've put together almost 4.5 hours of theory by Michael Ellis. These multi-chapter lessons are part of Michael Ellis's 2-day class on the electric collar. I've put this little trailer together so you could get a feel for the depth of instruction that Michael has to offer. If you're new to Michael Ellis and would like to get a glimpse of his teaching style and knowledge, watch the free 88-minute lecture that we stream on Michael's philosophy of dog training.
This morning I'll have a lecture on kind of our basic communication system, operant and classical conditioning, how we introduce escape avoidance training, and then how we're going to layer the collar over. And then we're going to talk about the mechanics of the collar, what I like in collars, how we're going to set levels, and then how we layer it over and which behaviors we initially layer it over before we go forward with it. In the past, we frequently would use the collar kind of like the bigger stick. Right? So we'd exhausted all of our other possibilities, and now, okay, the e-collar. We had an out problem, or we had some kind of control problem with the dog, and we'd kind of gone through the hierarchy of aversives, as it were, and we wound up at the collar, right? Which gave us all kinds of problems, right? So when we did it initially, we had very little forethought. So when I first started using a collar 15 years ago or so, we'd just slap it on a dog and hit them for stuff that we thought they should know, right? Lots of problems happen here. You get all kinds of superstitious behavior. Dogs associate the collar with all kinds of other things than the things that we intended them to associate it with. And we frequently gave ourselves a lot of trouble. So there was a period after I first started using the collar that I was like, no e-collars, right? These are bad news. We messed up a lot of dogs with e-collars, gave ourselves all kinds of problems. And then gradually we started to come back at it and approach it differently. And at first we started out super conservatively. And now in our system we use the collar quite a bit. But it's almost always layered over a behavior that the dog already understands, except for in a few places where we'll use it to stop some behaviors in everyday life, right? You know, great for stopping counter surfing, great for stopping chasing, and some stuff like that. So we will use it in certain places like that, where the dog doesn't necessarily have a lot of previous training with that behavior. But for the most part, we're going to use it to enforce behaviors that the dog already has some understanding of. And our approach to training is to teach almost all of those initial behaviors in a reward-based system. So we teach our dogs how to sit and down and stand and heel and come and touch and all those other things with rewards first. So the dog learns to work to get to something they want. And then we layer pressure over that process, first with a leash and then with the e-collar. And if you approach it this way, you get very little fallout from the collar use. It'll be just like any other tool in your box. It'll be just like a leash. It'll be just like anything else. The dog will understand what's happening, and you get very little fallout. The dogs look happy. The dogs look motivated, and you get the power of the collar. Sure. One of the things about the e-collar is that it allows us to do certain things timing-wise and distance-wise that's almost impossible with traditional methods, right? We can communicate certain things to the dog 100 yards away. We can communicate it in a really timely fashion. We can pass the remote to different people depending on what behavior we're doing and where the dog is in proximity to the handler, which allows us some really clear communication in terms of timing that are really difficult to get with a long line and a leash, for instance, right? And so it's really powerful in that way, in that it can do things that we have a really hard time doing with other tools. The problem with it is that the collar itself really lends itself to superstitious behavior because electricity doesn't feel like anything else the dog's ever felt, right? One of the things about manual pressure, when we're talking about escape avoidance stuff, about manual pressure, is that it feels natural to a dog in a sense, in that dogs bite each other, wrestle, you put your hands on them. They're used to physical sensations that are like that. But electricity, not used to anything like that. That's totally out of their repertoire, right? And so if we're not careful about how we layer that in, we get big problems where the dog thinks it's something other than what we wanted. They think it's the environment. They think it's what they were standing next to or whatever. So we'll go through that. So this morning, I'll lecture on classical and operant conditioning, escape avoidance training, which is all pressure training. So anytime you're using pressure of any kind in your training, leash pressure, corrections, e-collar, anything aversive all falls somewhere under the realm of escape and avoidance training. And so we're going to talk extensively about that and about what situations it works well in and what situations it doesn't work well in, right? There's a reason that a lot of people are really into reward-based training right now. And we'll talk about why that is. Like there are some things, some behaviors especially, that really lend themselves to reward-based training, and there are some that lend themselves to escape avoidance training. And it's good if you know why those things are that way. Okay. Then without further ado, we're going to jump in, and I'm going to define some terms for you guys first so that we know we're speaking the same language as we go along here. And the first term we're going to talk about is classical conditioning. Right? So I'm going to lecture a little bit on classical and operant conditioning, which are basically the components of learning theory and how dogs learn everything they learn, right? So everything we do in dog training is going to fall under either classical or operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is also called associative learning, right? And there was a Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov working in a lab. He had dogs in the lab that he was doing tests on salivary responses in dogs. And he noticed that as he went along in his tests, the presence of the researchers who fed the dogs and took care of the dogs was having an effect on his studies. So he set up these automated feeders to feed the dogs without the researchers being in the room, because the researchers were having an effect on the dogs. And so it had a tone or a bell that sounded before food dropped into the automated feeders for the dogs. And he noticed that after a number of repetitions, tone, food, tone, food, tone, food, tone, food, that the tone would sound and the dogs would actually start to salivate. The dogs would actually have a physical response to what was previously a meaningless stimuli. So that tone meant nothing to the dog, but by predicting food or a primary reward or primary reinforcer, then it came to create the same feelings in the dog that the primary reinforcer itself would, right? That the reward would. So the dog would act when it heard the tone like it would in the presence of food.
And once again, this is just the first few minutes of a 1 hour and 18-minute lecture of Chapter 1. And there's 3 chapters that total about 4 hours and 30 minutes on Michael's theory on training with a remote collar.